Before I start to tell the story that I'm going to tell, I just want to say that I keep on Facebook getting messages about the flame, and I've never had a Sunday that I had off at the time that this is. I've never been able to come before. And I realized, sitting here tonight and listening to...
Jeffrey, senior moments, you were at the first one.
I was?
Yeah. I looked at the photographs today.
I'm actually a year younger than Charles. I might have been here physically.
Never done this before, so don't...
Not here mentally. I would appreciate it if you don't interrupt me. I've been in Japan for 44 years, which is since 1969, and I've often, I do about 100 public speeches a year, and I do a lot of storytelling in Japanese, but this is really the first time that I've told the story in English, so I would appreciate it if you might know the end of the story when before I get there, that you don't shout it out. Let me tell it. A few people who didn't know what was coming before it came. But I just wanted to say before I start that man is a communicating animal, and communication is the making of meaning. And I think, of course, we started out with Charles doing Brad, Stuart, and I, and Phil. And there's a different kind of storytelling, there's a different kind of face, and there's a different kind of, to borrow Charles's word, different kind of punctuation in everything that people do. But I like Stuart starting with Charles's pictures, because there's this idea of expressing yourself, and Phil was talking in this last part about this wanting to express yourself. And so I think part of storytelling is expressing yourself. But I don't really care if you're listening. Because there's another part of storytelling, which is you're telling the story to yourself, to redefine yourself. And so this is a very personal story. It's to redefine myself. And I did write it out. And Charles wanted to make sure that I didn't go over the 15-minute line. And I read what I'd written, and it was 4.5 minutes. So I thought, I have to embellish a little. So I've started out by saying that I think people tell stories not only for the people who are listening, but also for the people they are to themselves. So I'm going to tell you a story that I've titled Father Knows Best, subtitled Everyone Has a Father. I grew up at a time when television was black and white, and Father Knows Best was one of the popular TV shows. So if you grew up in that time, then you know what I'm talking about. It was a time when things were very clear. So I'm going to tell you about my father. My father is a very complex man. But when I was a kid, I thought he was really simple, easy to understand. A really simple guy. My mother was a reader. She read over 100 books a year. She read 2 or 3 books a week. About half of them novels, about half of them nonfiction. And she was always reading, and she would tell us about the things in the book. She would tell us the things she'd learned from the books. And so I knew my mother was really complex. My father, the only thing I ever saw him reading was the newspaper, and he didn't even read much of that. He was a traveling salesman, selling wherever. Wherever is wears forever. It's sold with a lifetime guarantee. As long as you live, these pots and pans will not wear out. My father was a wherever pots and pans salesman selling mostly to farmers, housewives in North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota. So he wasn't home most of the week. He was only home on the weekends. There are two things I remember about my father. The first is his snoring. He snored loud enough that when I was in junior high school and I had a room in the basement, the floor under his bed, which was my ceiling, would actually move. He snored so loud that it's impossible to imagine. But somehow those snores, and I don't want to break down and cry, but they would make me feel so peaceful. I could sleep so deeply when he snored. The other thing I remember is one time he got really sunburned. I don't know what he'd been doing. I think he was working out in the yard, but he got really sunburned. He was this bright red, and he's Berglund is a Swedish name, so we're very white people, and we burn easily. And my mother was chasing him around the house. He was just in his underwear, and he was itchy and pain, and he was screaming, and she was with the calamine lotion trying to get it on him, as soon as she would touch with the calamine lotion, the touch was too much, and he would scream. My father was a traveling salesman, but he was really good with his hands. He liked building things. We had a big house. Well, I have to go back and tell you about when my father was born. My father was born in a small town, can we say that word? In South Dakota named Trent. The population when I was a child and we used to visit my grandparents was 87. It's a very, very small town. They had no grocery store. They had one, we called it a filling station. Now I think we say gas station. It's a very small town. My father used to brag, that he graduated 4th in his high school class. How many students? 4. And I was also born in South Dakota. I was born in Mitchell, South Dakota, which, if you ever get a chance to visit Mitchell, South Dakota, is the home of the Corn Palace. It's a large arena decorated on the outside with corn. Yellow and green and blue and red and brown corn. And I mean, this is an arena. These are huge walls, and they look like tapestries, all done with corn. And every year they redo the scenes. And they're like scenes out of the Bible, or the scenes out of history books, because these huge, 200-yard long and 75-yard high tapestries of corn. And this is something you don't see all over the United States. The Corn Palace. Well, I was born in Mitchell, South Dakota, but when I was 5, we moved to Minnesota, wherever put my father in Minneapolis. And we moved into a beautiful house in Bloomington, Minnesota. And my father, who was always very good with his hands, redid the basement. And he put in a small bar, and he put in a dance floor, and my mother and father used to have these parties. And my brother and my sister and I weren't allowed to go down to the parties. But we would listen, and the music was going, we could hear people talking and stuff like that. And then we'd get up early the next morning and we'd go downstairs, and there would always be leftover shrimp cocktail and pickled herring and mixed nuts and stuff like that. And we'd take little sips of, we didn't know what it was, we just knew it was something we weren't supposed to drink. But it was really safe. The snoring and the finished basement, and it was, we had this huge yard. We played wiffle ball, baseball, and you could hit the ball and go way out, and we had all that grass, and we made a little round rubber pool, third base, so you could, we played in our swimming suits, so you could slide into third base in the pool. But Minnesota was this really wet. Minnesota's the land of 10,000 lakes, is what it's called. It's a really wet place, and all this grass and the trees that my father put in when we first moved in, you know, quickly became what he called shade trees, these huge trees. And I had great friends. Gary Larson lived next door, and Tom Davies, and Glenn Christensen, who came to visit me in Japan, and Peter Merkline. And we used to play baseball in the vacant lot in the corner and ride our bicycles everywhere. It was a time when you took a clothespin and pinned a baseball card to the thing, and then when you rode your bicycle, it made this sound, you know, like it's like a motorcycle, you know. And I remember the time that we used to explore 9 Mile Creek. If you go Google Map and go to Bloomington, Minnesota, 9 Mile Creek, then you know where I grew up. And we used to explore down there. And I remember one winter we used to slide our sleds and we'd jump off before we got to the bottom because there was a steep embankment. And Kerry Tarbo, T-A-R-B-O-X, Tarbo, forgot to jump off his sled, and he went over the embankment and broke his nose, and there was all this blood and this white snow, and you know, impressions. You get impressions of snoring and calamine lotion and blood in the snow. But Minnesota was this really lush, really nice place. And then all of a sudden, when I was 12 years old, my father announced to the family that he was taking all the family savings and moving to Rapid City, South Dakota, and starting his own business. And he had this dream. He wanted to be an architect, and he wanted to build restaurants. And so we followed him, and we went to Rapid City, South Dakota. We moved on summer day. It was 105 degrees in Rapid City, South Dakota the day we moved in. And I told my friends in Minnesota that I was going to be riding a horse to school and carrying a snake bite kit because of all the rattlesnakes in South Dakota. And I was actually, you know, thinking that might be what was going to happen. Because I really didn't know a lot about the West. Minnesota was more like this lush East. But South Dakota is known as the Sunshine State, and there's not a lot of rain. And the day we moved in was, of course, no rain, and there was no grass around the house. It was all baked red dirt. And the house was a lot smaller than our house in Minnesota. And my brother and my sister and I were complaining, and even my mother was complaining. We'd left our friends, we'd left all the memories we'd made in Minnesota, and we were there 8 years. And my father hit his head as he was moving the couch. We went in a U-Haul truck, all the furniture in the back and us crammed into the cab in the front. And he hit his head as he was getting this couch out, and he said, "Shit!" This is the first time in my whole life that I ever heard my father use a swear word. And there was a lot of content in that one word. He didn't know if he was going to make it. He didn't know if he was going to be successful in making his own business. And he wanted us to support him, and here we were complaining. And I felt I gotta cheer for him. I think it was the first time I thought of my father as a person, a human, rather than a sort of a thing that was other than human, sort of godlike. So there we were in Rapid City, South Dakota, and that's where I went to junior high school. And junior high school is the time you learn a lot of things, and I got interested in girls for the first time. And the biggest thing I learned, masturbation. I didn't know anything about it. And there was this guy a year ahead of me, and he said, you know, if you sort of move up and down, it starts to feel real good. And then when this stuff squirts out, it really feels good. So I went home and I did this. And God, did it feel good. And then I started doing it 2 or 3 times a day. And I would always go into the bathroom and lock the door. And I used to take the newspapers, and I'd take the comics in the newspaper, and I'd put tracing paper over them, and I would trace the women, the outlines, but I would take off their clothes. And then I would pencil in the nipples and the pubic hair, and I would take that into the bathroom. And then one day I came home, I had midterm tests, and I came home from school, and no one was home. And my father had just come back from a business trip. And I knew that when he went on business trips, he often bought girly magazines. So nobody's home, and I went into his bedroom, and I popped open a suitcase, and here's a Playboy and a Gent. And I took him into the living room, and I sat in the easy chair in the corner of the living room, and got to work, and you really get focused. I think masturbation is the kind of thing that really focuses you. And you get focused in the pictures, and the pictures sort of focus your thoughts, and you get really excited because of the thoughts. You know, and you really get focused, and you can't hear anything. And I didn't hear my father's car pull in. And I didn't hear the kitchen door open. And all of a sudden, my father was walking through the living room, down the hall to his drawing room, where he did his architectural drawings. You know. And of course, I immediately stuck the magazines under the cushion and zipped up and got out one of my textbooks and sat in the corner. And he came back in with a drawing plan, and he said, "Oh, you're home." And I said, yeah. He said, "What are you home so early for?" And I said, "Oh, I got midterm tests." You know, my brother and sister were in grade school, so they were still at school, and my mom was volunteer working. So I said, "Oh, you're home alone?" I said, "Yeah, I'm studying." He said, "Well, I forgot this blueprint, so I came to get it. I'm going to go back to work now. See you tonight." And I said, "Sure." 30 years later, I had 3 sons, married in Japan. I was back in the States, and my father had built a house, a 5-sided house. It's beautiful. You can see it online. IncomparableView.com. That's my father's bed and breakfast. It's a beautiful house. And we were sitting late at night at the kitchen table, and I said to my father, because I had little children, you know, like 5, 6, 7-year-old kids, and I said, "What's the hardest thing about being a father?" And my father said, "Well, that time I came home from work." And I walked into the living room, and he said, "I didn't know what to say." I mean, he said, I couldn't say, "How are you?" because it was easy to see I was great. And he said, another common greeting is, "What are you doing?" And that wouldn't work because he knew right away what I was doing. And he didn't feel comfortable saying, "Go to it." So he pretended not to see. He pretended not to see. My father is now 87 years old. Since my mother died, single-handedly he runs a bed and breakfast. My father's a good gourmet chef. His Swedish pancakes are fantastic. He corns his own beef. If you stay with him, every morning will be a different breakfast. Once more, it's incomparableView.com. 87 years old. My father is a very complex man. And I know that he loves me. And I know that I love him. Thank you.